Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Sunflower Squad podcast. I'm your host, Lena Clark, and on this show, we dive deep into the world of user experience, sharing stories, strategies, and insights to help you navigate the intersection of design, public health, and technology. Whether you're new to UX or a seasoned pro, my goal is to empower you with the knowledge and tools to create better, more intuitive experiences. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Audrey Reinert, a senior user experience researcher who's revolutionizing the way that we think about UX and complex systems like AI and machine learning. Dr. Reinert is also the creator of the Reinert Method, a structured project management approach focused on detailed planning, fast iterations, and delivering practical results. Beyond her professional work, she's a passionate cosplayer and brings the same project management principles to her creative process, blending research with the art of cosplay in some truly innovative ways. Before we dive into the conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this podcast. It's the best way to support my mission of making good UX accessible to everyone. Now, let's get started. Okay, I am so excited for this conversation today. I am speaking with Dr. Audrey Reinert today. And would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So, as Lena said, I'm Dr. Audrey Reinert. I'm a senior quantitative UX researcher with over 10 years of research expertise, focusing on UX problems as they relate to human guided machine learning, artificial intelligence, and user safety. I also happen to be an avid cosplayer. So, I'm here to talk to you all today about the Reinert method of product development and how it overlaps strongly with cosplay and UX.
Yeah, thank you for introducing yourself. And for my listeners, you've heard me speak about the difference between quantitative researchers and qualitative researchers. I often like to let people know that I am just super, super qualitative. I can do a little bit of the quantitative, but then when I get to a certain point, that's when I pull in more of the quant focus researchers. Audrey, can you talk to us a little bit about quantitative research?
Sure. So, bit of context for the audience. My PhD is actually in industrial engineering, concentrating on human factors. So, a lot of the quantitative research that I have done in the past and that folks like me do, we tend to focus, at least the way I think of quant versus qual. Both are very useful ways at getting at different aspects of the user experience. Qualitative often focuses on how users feel and how they experience a product, system, or service on an emotional level. Quant is much more of the behavioral side and trying to understand using information such as click patterns. You can also look at mouse trace, mouse paths, and other data like that to try and model and understand user behavior so that you can identify where user pain points are, then bring in qualitative data to make new design recommendations. So, long story short, your qual folks are focusing on how people feel about an interface. Quant is focusing on what is their behavior saying about their experience as it appears in the data.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down for us. For the listeners, similar to Audrey, I do have a background in human factors as well. But even while I was doing the human factors research, I was still very much on the qualitative side, working with the industrial engineers that were looking at the quantitative metric to create that holistic perspective of what the users were experiencing, what their needs were, and how we could elevate the systems that they interacted with. In my case, to help keep them safe out in the fields if they're in the oil mining process. That was a lot of the research that I would do. And so, what I think is really cool, Audrey, about your work is that over the years, you've developed the Reinhardt method for product development. Can you explain to our listeners what that is and how they can use it for their own product?
The Reinert method, in kind of about 30 seconds, it is a way for you to scope, scale, and templatize your projects by focusing on delivering actionable results at a consistent pace. So ultimately, what you are trying to do, and again, this is the kind of industrial engineer in me speaking is as you are planning out your research projects or any other type of product that you are trying to develop, you're trying to make sure that you are planning with precision. So you want to make sure you're making informed strategic decisions with specific goals in mind. You're also willing to adapt those plans just because, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later. Once you actually start working on your project or working in this, on research, the initial plan you had doesn't always match with the reality in front of you. And then there's a focus on efficient execution. Ultimately, you want to deliver products quickly and effectively while minimizing, resource waste or material waste.
You brought up a good point about once you really get into the weeds of the project, sometimes things just don't align to what your expectations were. Can you speak to what someone should do when they find themselves in that situation?
One of the first things I recommend people do is to stop and take a breath. Even if you're finding yourself a little bit frustrated, I sometimes recommend walking away from the problem for a little bit to clear your head. In the context of research problems, if you're feeling like, oh, as you are working on this and you're finding, oh man, this data just isn't working. It's not, I'm having trouble maybe writing the proper analysis script in R or Python. Sometimes just taking a step and asking you and just clearing your head can be very helpful. I know having a tendency to get a little bit stuck in and try to force things can actually break things worse than they already were. So coming back at the problem with a clear head and maybe also reevaluating the methods you're using, especially if you're trying to analyze certain types of data. The kind of classic example that I look at is if I'm trying to analyze mouse trace behavior. So we've got somebody's mouse, we are looking at where they are in time. You can analyze that as a time series and say, okay, based on at this time, you can get the XY position and you can get some information. But ultimately, stepping back and asking, what is the question you're trying to solve? In this case, if we're looking at mouse trace data, where are people spending the most time hovering over? Maybe a time series isn't the best bit of information, but maybe a heat map showing most people are fixating or kind of tracing between 2 or 3 points on the screen. Taking a little bit of a break and then asking, what am I trying to get at with this method?
Yeah, I think when people start to do research or start to just ask general questions about whatever project they're working on,
Mhm.
their biggest fear is what if I don't figure out the right information, or
Yeah.
what if the information I find out changes the course of things? And I don't know about you, but I find it exciting when new information changes the course. This is when we want to have
Oh, yeah.
that information.
So, as somebody, one of the things my PhD advisor told me is like, oh, there's going to be times and places where when you come into a problem and you are trying to solve it, you have your hypothesis in your head. I I think that users are not engaging with our product because the layout is wrong. How do I want to prove this? I want to prove it by looking at mouse traces. As kind of a toy example. Sometimes the anti-finding of the, "Oh, no, it's not actually mouse data that is suggesting this," is as useful as finding out that correct, kind of correct answer. So understanding that even if it is a kind of negative result, a result you didn't necessarily want, that still can be informative for product design or thinking about that user's experience.
And then as we get into that execution phase of a
Mhm.
project, what are your tips and tricks? What do
Cool.
you warn people of? Talk us through that.
So, with regard to research processes or with regard to like cosplay in general?
Honestly, that
Oh,
is a good
okay.
segue. Let's talk a
Yeah.
little bit about cosplay.
So I'm one of those folks. I really, really, all my friends joke that if there is one thing Audrey loves more than anything in this world, it is a good spreadsheet. But more specifically, thinking about it as a spreadsheet in terms of a Kanban board or also a way to track sprint processes. When we're thinking about the execution of the task, and if you've never actually worked on a big project, a big multi-year research project or costuming project, it can be really intimidating to know where to start. I kind of liken it to you're standing at the base of a mountain and you know you want to get to the top of the mountain, but you don't necessarily know how to. One of the things that I've learned over the years that led to the Reinert method is you try and segment out your projects into smaller and smaller chunks. This way you can say, all right, this particular week, I am focusing on data collection and data analysis of this particular set of information. So we'll just go with mouse trace behavior or maybe looking at survey responses. In terms of cosplay, now for context, I do a lot of 3D printing. I actually have not really a failed print, but to give you an idea, this was part of a Halloween costume that I ended up not using for a variety of reasons. But
And what universe is that mask from?
it's actually not from any particular universe. It's just, I found the file online and purchased it. If folks are interested, I can make sure the information gets linked in the description.
I would love that, and I just
Oh,
wanna
yeah.
take a moment to say that, that was the failed iteration, and you just pulled out,
It's
like, the coolest looking thing from
Well,
nowhere.
and a lot of failed iterations are not necessarily that pretty. This one failed because I used the wrong kind of material for what I wanted to use it for, but we're not gonna get into the material science of 3D printing because, oh boy, that'd be a very different podcast. But when we're thinking about planning and production, especially when we're talking about research as a part of a product design, breaking down what you want to do and say, okay, well, this month I want to work on mm, building. So one of the cosplays that I'm currently working on is a Rings of Power Galadriel, and one of the big things that I'm working on is some chest armor. And I have basically said I am taking the month of October. That is the only thing I am working on for that cosplay. It helps. And when we're thinking about this from a user research process, having a clear, all right, at the end of the month, here's where I want my goal to be. Here's what I want it to look like, because it provides you this nice little checkpoint to say, all right, every Friday, I want to see if I have made progress towards the production of this finished chess piece. If I haven't, well, I can also use those kind of weekly sprint check ins to say, well, what isn't working? So basically, using your agile and Kanban methodologies to say, okay, I am breaking this down into small, manageable chunks so that you feel like you are building that sense of momentum and still moving forward.
This this conversation feels so timely for me. Over the last year, my company, Sunflower UX, we started our graphic novel, our public health graphic novel called The
Mhm.
Sunflower Squad. And when we were iterating on my character and bringing that cosplay to life, my team that is used to working with me on UX projects now also got to work with me on a cosplay project.
Mhm.
There were a lot of moving pieces. I'd never written lore around a costume that I was building. I knew I wanted to incorporate really intricate 3D hair pieces and really dynamic makeup that I usually don't get to leverage. And I have to say, it was pure chaos.
Oh,
I
yeah.
know yeah, like, I know how to project manage. I always anticipate right before a cosplay event that it's going to be a little hectic. Trying to pull both of those worlds together was a lot. I know that the next time I need to do that, I'm going to be leveraging
Mhm.
your spreadsheet for sure. Can you speak to, as you were developing your spreadsheets and as you really solidify your connection between UX and cosplay, what is your hope for how that can support other people?
As somebody who's worked on a lot of really big, really complicated processes, having a spreadsheet or something like that, because I also have a lot of friends who are neurodivergent. and specifically they have ADD or ADHD. So planning and coordination is very tricky for them. And there's also a couple friends of mine who have autism spectrum. So they tend to be the sort of folks who they get very, very fixated. And this is not neither a good thing nor bad thing. It's just it can be very it some of them have expressed that it can be kind of a hindrance because they will notice like, oh man, I spent so long trying to make this particular part perfect because it became their hyperfixation that they felt that they weren't making meaningful progress. So the purpose of something like the Reinert method is to say, okay, well, we're not going to try to break that. We're not going to try to do that because, a psychologist. I'm a doctor, not the kind that helps people. Sorry, had to make that joke. Um, but it also says, okay, let's try and convert this energy. Let's try and convert this desire to get something done and to satisfy that fixation by putting it in a very manageable state. So instead of saying, oh boy, I'm going to get super excited and I'm going to work on everything. And then I feel like I'm making no progress. We're going to say, no, we're just working on one thing at a time because it becomes easier to centralize your focus onto one thing. And it's also very useful for when we're talking about different phases of the finished product. If we're building, because I talk about your minimum testable, your minimum viable, and your finished product. Your minimum testable is in cosplay terms, it's a can I put everything on and walk around my house and make sure it fits? Which, if you've ever worn like really complicated cosplay and as somebody who 3D prints armor a lot, you don't realize how hot it can get. Same if you've ever had to wear complex makeup or wigs, it can really very quickly become like, oh, this is more painful than I thought. There's actually, I'll share a photo with Lena that can be shared around of me wearing a wig that was too small for my head. It was a miserable experience.
I
That
tend
has,
to choose options that mean I won't be
oh,
able to sit for 12 hours at a time, be it
yeah.
the shoes or, like, just the skirts that I'll wear, and,
Mm.
I mean, I willingly sign up for it every time, but it's a lot to plan for and make sure that I can at least make tiny little steps on whatever type of ground
Oh,
I have to walk on.
I, when I first started doing cosplay, one of the pieces of advice somebody gave at the risk of being a little crass was, hey, make sure that you can drink water and make sure that you can figure out how to go to the bathroom. Because if you don't,
Yes.
you can have a very bad experience.
There's nothing like trying to run to the bathroom and you have a bunch of hooks and snaps and maybe not a support staff with you and you're
Mhm.
just it's a meltdown moment for
Oh,
sure.
yeah. It can be very frustrating.
Yeah, and it's amazing how much that cosplay creative process parallels the UX creative process. I think one of the biggest things as I'm coaching, especially like small business owners that are trying to create new experiences for their brand, it's
Mhm.
that I try to remind them, hey, what is that minimal viable product that you can get out there and see how it works? It would be impossible to build 100% of
Yeah.
everything up front. And you really don't want to build everything up front. You want to build a little bit, test it, get that feedback, iterate, and then move forward or change course if that's the right thing to do.
To build on that point, knowing, I don't like using the term knowing when to quit, but knowing when to, as somebody who's worked in academia for a while, who spent time in academia, one of the things that can be very hard to let go of is a finished product will eventually be perfect. A perfect product is never finished. I know I've had multiple colleagues that missed important publication deadlines because they spent time, trying to tweak some last minute wording that end of the day probably was not going to make or break their acceptance into the journal.
Exactly. At the end of the day, it can be very difficult to go on and submit something when we have a little bit
Mm.
of perfectionist in us.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I always encourage people to go on and wherever you are, go on and move forward with that piece. And
Mm.
there's always a tomorrow. There's always more time. You can come back to it if it truly needs it. You might open the door into some new opportunities and realize that what you were struggling over was actually good enough.
ultimately, and I know this might sound like it's not being lazy, it's being efficient. That
Yes.
sometimes good enough, especially, and this is one of the things that the Reinert myth helps you with, is to understand there's time, money, and energy that you can devote to a project. And sure, there are reasons why you might want to maybe change the product scope and add a little bit more. I know I have definitely been guilty of when I'm working on big projects. Sometimes you find that really cool nugget of information that you want to dive into, and
Hmm.
oh, it's just another couple days of analysis, but it's a no. At the end of the day, that 2 or 3 extra days that I spend on analysis can prevent actually getting a finished product to developers so that they can start actually building. So understanding that, if I have X amount of time, X amount of budget, X amount of material to work on something, a finished product in somebody's hand that they can start making decisions with is ultimately better than than spending a lot of time trying to get that last little 2 or 3% to perfection.
Yeah. And oftentimes developers are just happy to have something from UX to go with
Mhm.
because UX can often be a luxury that developers don't get to coordinate with. So that has taken some weight off of my shoulders when projects have gotten a little crazy.
Mm.
Audrey, I really want to thank you for your
Yeah.
time today. If people want to find out more about you and the Reinert method, where can they go?
So you can look me up on LinkedIn, Audrey E. Reiner. You can look at my LinkedIn page. From there, you can also find a link to my portfolio. There's also a short form video of the Reinert method, all linked on LinkedIn as well. That kind of gives you the 5-minute introduction. And then there's a long form version going into all the different steps on the portfolio. Mhm.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this insightful conversation with Dr. Audrey Reinert. If you're curious to learn more about her work, check out the show notes for links to her LinkedIn profile, her project management methodology, and even her super useful cosplay building spreadsheet, which I know personally I'm going to use on my next project. Whether you're into UX research or just love creative problem solving, there's so much more to explore. And as always, if you found value in today's episode, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. It helps me continue spreading the word about good UX and reaching even more users. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.